Hello everyone. In this lecture, we will study how to solve the key management problem in public key cryptography. That is, how to authenticate a public key in order to gain assurance that the public key belongs to a specific person or the entity with which we want to communicate and not some attacker. The public key infrastructure and public key certificates are the standard solution for how this problem is solved today. And that is why we will study this topic in detail. Let's look at how the public key infrastructure works. We have three main parties in this process. We have a user who has a key pair. The user sends their public key to a certificate authority who will then issue a public key certificate attesting that this public key belongs to this user. Verifiers trust this certificate authority and therefore implicitly or indirectly trust that this public key belongs to this user. So the entire purpose of a public key certificate is to bind a public key to an identity. If you forget everything else from this lecture, remember this sentence. This sentence answers the question of why we need PKI and public key certificates and the problem it solves. So it allows us to establish which public key belongs to which entity or identity. So the main actors are the user, also known as subject, subscriber, or end entity. The certificate authority, also known as a trusted third party, and issuer because it issues these public key certificates. And then the verifier, who verifies the certificate. Here we commonly use the term relying party because it is a party that relies on the correctness of this identity assertion made in the public key certificate. Now, if we look carefully at this idea, we will realize that we have not invented anything really new here. We have been using the same idea for decades in the non-digital world in the context of identity documents, for example, in passports. Let's consider the passport analogy. The question you might have is that if a certificate binds a public key to an identity, what does a passport bind together? Well, sure, a passport also contains information about its holder's identity, but what serves as the public key in the case of a passport? What is the key information contained in the passport without which the passport would not serve its purpose? Right, it is biometrics, the photo of the passport holder. The photo is the public key, and the document holder himself, in a way, is the private key because we believe that each person is unique and it is not possible to create the person from their photo. Now, the trusted third party for the passport analogy is the state or state institution that has issued the identity document. And the relying parties are those who rely on the identity document when verifying the identity of the document holder. So you see that this is the same idea. The only difference is that here the certificate authority uses a digital signature to provide integrity for the certificate. And the purpose is to establish the ownership of a public key and not the biometric data. This is what an X.509 public key certificate contains, looking at it from a high level. X.509 here is the name of the standard that describes public key certificates. So we have here identity of the subject to whom the certificate has been issued, the issuer who signed this certificate, in this case VeriSign root certificate authority. Here is the public key of the subject, a serial number which serves as an identifier for the certificate similar to a passport number, a validity term of the certificate, and some other data. And all this information is digitally signed by the CA specified here. So these two fields, the subject name and the public key, are the most important fields in the certificate. Without these, the certificate would lose its purpose. Okay? Let's look at the most popular PKI use cases where the public key certificates are used today. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bubbles here. The biggest use case of certificates today is server authentication. Our internet browsers are constantly connecting to servers which prove their identity using public key certificates, be it Facebook or our online bank. So the confidentiality of the data we send over the internet relies on the security of the public infrastructure. This means that today each of us is involved in the PKI, at least as the relying parties. The next bubble by size could be digital signatures. We have the eIDAS regulation in Europe, which gives a digital signature the same legal status as that of a handwritten signature. Each digital signature is linked to a public key certificate that identifies the signatory. In this part of Europe, the use of digital signatures is quite popular. Then we use certificates for code signing. Perhaps you have noticed that when you try to run some binary file in Windows, it shows who has signed the binary file and asks whether you trust the publisher and want to run it. Then the next bubble is perhaps client authentication, quite popular in Estonia, where we can use an electronic ID card and the certificate stored in it to authenticate to remote servers. So instead of using some password, we can authenticate to a server by presenting our public key certificate and proving that we have access to the corresponding private key. And then the last bubble is the use of certificates to sign and encrypt emails using S/MIME protocol. Here is a screenshot of how such an encrypted and signed email looks. Now, in practice, for a long time, I have not seen anyone using S/MIME to sign their emails. So this use case is not too popular for various reasons. Now, in this course, we will look at these three use cases in more detail. But now let's talk about certificate authorities. So what is a certificate authority? Essentially, it is a trusted third party. Now the question is, where does this trust come from? Who decides whether a CA should be trusted or not? Well, in the case of server certificates, these are software vendors who decide on our behalf. When we install a browser, it comes with a list of CAs the browser trusts. So if you're running a CA, we can convince Mozilla and Google that we are trustworthy and therefore should be included in their browsers. In the case of legally binding digital signature certificates, there is the European Union eIDAS regulation, which sets requirements for CAs issuing digital signature certificates. Each European Union member state has to maintain a list of these trusted CAs and verify that they comply with the legal requirements specified in the eIDAS regulation. So if you're running a CA and wish to issue digital signature certificates, we have to apply for a trusted status through the local supervisory authority. But okay, let's say that we want to start a CA business. So what are the actual steps? How can we get our CA trusted? First of all, our goal, most likely, is to make a profit. Perhaps you may find interesting the story about Ubuntu founder Mark Shuttleworth. In the late 90s, he was running a successful CA business, which he sold for more than $500 million. He used that money to fund Ubuntu and also go to space as a tourist. So thanks to his successful CA business, we have Ubuntu. Today, running a CA business would be much harder because there are CAs that provide certificates free of charge. So today, it is much harder to make a lot of money with the CA business. Anyway, so what do we need in practice to get our CA certificate into the trust stores? We need to get our CA into the trust stores because otherwise no one will be interested in buying our certificates, right? The first thing is that we have to order a compliance audit. There are two standards which we need to comply with, Web Trust for server certificates and HCTS for digital signature certificates. These compliance audits have to be performed by accredited auditing companies. In this region, we have Ernst & Young and KPMG. The audits themselves are not very technical. There is some checklist which is used to verify whether we are following the procedures for key management, identity verification, certificate issuance, and so on. We have to perform these audits every year for server certificates or once every 2 years if we want to issue digital signature certificates. A few years ago, these audits cost around 15,000 euros, but perhaps we can afford it. And then we have to purchase liability insurance in case we want to issue digital signature certificates. This is required by EIDAS. The idea is that we, as a certificate authority, are liable for the correctness of data included in the certificates. If we misissue some certificate and as a result some relying party experiences losses, the relying party can sue us, asking for compensation for the damage. For this reason, EIDAS requires mandatory civil liability insurance. By Estonian law, the insurance policy must cover 1 million euros. The problem in practice is that the insurance industry is reluctant to insure against cybersecurity risks. The industry has good risk models for insuring against car incidents, accidents, property damage, and so on, but there is not enough data on the risks of cybersecurity incidents. In practice, we can find an insurance company that will sell us an insurance policy even for as low as 3,000 euros annually. But if we actually read the policy, we will see that there are a lot of exceptions, and basically it does not cover security risks such as malware and insider threat, which are the most likely reasons for incidents, right? So this insurance policy would be pretty much useless in practice, but who cares? We have obtained valid insurance and formally we satisfy the legal requirements. Then the final expense is that the security standards require the use of a so-called hardware security module or HSM for storing CA private keys. Basically, an HSM is a physically protected private key storage device. It can securely store the key and perform cryptographic operations within it inside the device, such that the private key never leaves the device. It receives plaintext from outside, performs signing, and returns only the signature to the outside world. I hope it is obvious that we cannot store CA private keys in My Documents folder on our computer, right? So some additional hardware security measures are needed. There are different types of HSMs. Here you see a network HSM, which is essentially a full-blown computer that can receive plaintext over the network, sign, and return it. It has a high throughput. It can perform thousands of cryptographic operations per second. Usually, these devices also have pretty advanced methods of how to activate the private key. For example, using some hardware tokens with PIN codes, which have to be activated by several persons together, and so on. And this device may already cost tens of thousands of euros and can be the most expensive hardware part for running the CA business. HSMs can also be in the form of a PCA extension card or even a USB token. A smart card can also serve as an HSM, but it is rather slow and lacks some more advanced capabilities of an HSM. Now, these HSMs are usually certified at different security levels, and to store the CA private key, we would need to use an HSM that is certified at some specific minimum security level. Here you can read Mozilla's CA inclusion policy to see the requirements needed to get your CA into the trust store used by Mozilla products. But the point here is that this is doable. We can become a trusted CA quite easily. And the good thing for us is that removing the trust from us if we misbehave as a CA is rather difficult in practice. In the history of PKI, there have been just a few CAs that have been kicked out from the Mozilla and Google trust stores. Now, in practice, the certificate chain or hierarchy may look like this, where we have a root CA, which is self-signed, and we call it as a trust anchor. This root CA may issue several intermediate CA certificates, which in turn can also issue intermediate CA certificates. And finally, those can issue end entity certificates. So a CA can delegate trust to subordinate or intermediate CAs. When the CA issues a certificate, it can specify in the certificate whether this will be a CA certificate and is therefore allowed to issue other certificates, or this is an end entity certificate. This subordination is useful for risk limitation. Usually, the root CA's private key will be stored offline, but the intermediate CA may be connected to the internet where it automatically issues certificates. In case the private key of the intermediate CA is compromised, the intermediate CA certificate can be revoked and a new one issued. Otherwise, if the root CA private key gets compromised and has to be revoked, it is a lot of trouble because a new root CA must be established, getting it again into the trust stores of the relevant parties and so on. The intermediate CAs may be operated by different divisions or units of the root CA and may have different security policies. For example, one intermediate CA can be used to issue server certificates, another for issuing digital signature certificates, and so on. If one gets compromised, it can be revoked without compromising other intermediate CAs under the same root CA. So instead of establishing our own root CA and getting it trusted, we may approach any existing trusted CA and ask them to issue us an intermediate CA certificate. This way, our intermediate CA certificate would immediately get implicitly trusted. But the root CA would still be responsible for ensuring that our CA gets audited and follows the same security requirements of the root CA. Let's make a more in-depth look at the certificate and its ASN1 notation. The certificate is one big sequence which consists of three fields. TBS certificate field, which contains certificate data to be signed. Then we have the signature algorithm that was used by the CA to sign the TBS certificate field, and then the signature value encoded as a bit string. If you look at the data which is to be signed, then we have version number of the X.509 standard, serial number of type integer. The requirement for serial number is that it must be unique for each certificate issued by the CA. Other fields can be the same in several certificates, but the serial number must be unique. Okay. Here we have a signature algorithm, the same value as in the outer sequence. Then the issuer's identity, the period of validity, which is encoded as 2 dates, not before and not after specifying the period for which this identity assertion should be considered valid. Then we have the subject's identity describing the subject, and the subject's public key encoded as the subject public key infrastructure, which you already saw in the previous lectures. Then there can be certificate extensions, which are optional. Every extension has an object identifier identifying the type of extension, criticality flag, and extension value. We will take a deeper look at the most popular extensions in a few slides. The certificate structure you see on this slide is defined in this RFC. This summarizes what we discussed on the previous slide. Now, the question is, how do we actually identify the issuer and subject in the certificate? And this is where the type distinguished name comes into play. The standard says that the issuer and subject field is defined as the X.509 type name, defined by the following ASN1 structure. So here is a sequence with several sets. Each set contains a sequence which has a type and value. The type is identified by an object identifier. The data type of the value can be any, but usually contains some printable data. Essentially, it is yet another notation for unique identifiers. We have object identifiers, which identifies by position in the object identifier tree, and now we have distinguished name, which identifies by these type value pairs. These type of identifiers you also encounter in LDAP and related protocols. Here is an example of how such a distinguished name may look. Common name equals John Doe. Organizational unit is help desk. Organization is Burgers Inc. And the country code is the United States. The idea is that these fields taken together should uniquely identify the particular entity. Does it identify the entity? Well, that depends on how many details we include in this distinguished name. Now, if we ASN1 encode this distinguished name and dump ASN1 it, This is what we will see. We see a sequence which contains several sets. Each set contains a sequence with type and value. This object identifier identifies country name, and the value here is printable string US, and so on. These are the object identifiers of other commonly used types. This is used to encode the last name, given name, serial number. The serial number usually encodes personal identification codes for natural persons. Locality, name, state or province, and email address. Let's discuss the certificate extensions a bit. Version 3 of the X.509 standard introduced certificate extensions where we can specify more details about the certificate and its holder. These extensions are encoded by a triplet: extension ID, which is an object identifier, then the criticality flag, true or false, and the extension value encoded as an octet string. Every extension has an object identifier, and the X.509 standard defines several standard certificate extensions which have to be recognized by standards compliant certificate path validation algorithms. We can invent our own extensions by registering a unique object identifier, but this, of course, will not guarantee that our extension will be automatically recognized by all certificate validation software out there. We can use this criticality flag to specify how software that does not recognize our extension should handle such an extension. The idea is that each extension in a certificate is designated as either critical or non-critical. A certificate using system must reject the certificate if it encounters a critical extension it does not recognize or a critical extension that contains information that it cannot process. A non-critical extension may be ignored if it is not recognized, but must be processed if it is recognized. So, if our extension is critical, for example, it specifies some important limitations on the use of certificate, which is crucial for the relying party to understand, then we set this criticality flag to true. And in case the relying party does not understand this extension, the certificate will be rejected. So, in this case, the extension will be handled in a fail-safe manner, so to say. Let's go over the most popular certificate extensions that you will encounter in real-world certificates. The key usage extension limits the purpose of the key contained in the certificate. It is defined as a bit string where each bit specifies some purpose. Digital signature if the key can be used to sign data. Non-repudiation if the key can be used to create legally binding digital signatures. Key encipherment if the key can be used to encrypt keys. Data encipherment if the key can be used to directly encrypt data. Key agreement if the key can be used to negotiate symmetric keys, for example, using Diffie-Hellman. Key cert sign if the key can be used to sign certificates, so this would be set for a CA certificate. CRL sign to sign certificate revocation lists. The encipher and decipher only are the bits defined by the key agreement used. If this extension is not present, the key may be used for all purposes. Okay? The extended key usage extension indicates a more specific purpose of the key. Here are some standard key usages defined by an object identifier. Server authentication, client authentication, code signing, email protection, and so on. If you create your own application or protocol, you can register an object identifier and put it in the certificate, defining that the certificate can be used only in the context of your specific application. Okay? The requirement is that this extended key usage extension must be consistent with the key usage specified in the key usage extension. For example, if the code signing is set here, the digital signature must also be set in the key usage, and so on. Some other extensions. The basic constraints extension identifies whether the subject certificate is a CA, that is, whether it may issue certificates. For a CA certificate, it defines the maximum subordinate CAs it may have. This is how the ASN1 structure looks. CA, Boolean, true or false, and an optional path length constraint specifying how many subordinate CAs can be in the path below this CA certificate. If CA flag is true, the key use extension must be absent or must have the key cert sign bit set. Okay. There have been incidents where a CA has incorrectly set the CA flag, effectively allowing the recipients of the entity certificates to act as a CA. For example, to issue other entity certificates and perform man-in-the-middle attacks. So this flag has to be handled very carefully. The certificate policies extension contains a pointer to policy information. This extension can contain a URL to the certificate practice statement, specify object identifier of the document version, or contain an explicit notice text. The idea is that each CA has to maintain a detailed document specifying the procedure of how the identity of the subject is verified, the limitations for certificate use, and so on. These certificate policies are legally binding contracts between the CA, subject, and relying party. Now, this legal information is not machine readable and therefore cannot be handled by certificate validation algorithms. Basically, we would need a lawyer who reads these 100 or so pages and provides us with legal advice on the risks that we take by accepting the certificate. For example, the certificate policy could contain a statement that the certificate should not be accepted for electronic transactions that exceed some amount of money. But if we accepted the certificate for such transaction, then the transaction would not be legally valid. So, as you see, there is a legal side of the reliance on the certificate. Some more extensions. Subject alternative name extension can be used to alternatively identify the subject as an alternative to the subject name. It provides more flexibility than the subject name since it can include email, DNS, IP addresses, URIs, and other identifiers. The latest standards promote use of this extension to identify the subject because distinguished name is quite limited in what it can contain. The authority key identifier and subject key identifier extensions help to uniquely identify subject and issuer certificates. The authority key identifier in the certificate should match the subject key identifier contained in the CA certificate that issued it. So this helps certificate path validation algorithms to easier locate the corresponding issuer certificate. The CRL distribution points extension includes the URI where the certificate revocation list is available. The Authority Information Access extension indicates how to access information about CA and its services. The Subject Information Access extension indicates how to access information about the subject. Okay? Basically, extensions could include any data. For example, they could include the picture of the subject, attributes, roles, and so on. Okay? Okay, very good. Let's see how certificates are used in HTTPS when a browser establishes a secure connection to a server using the Transport Layer Security Protocol, or TLS. As it was mentioned before, TLS server certificates are the most popular use case of X.509 certificates. Here you can see that we have connected to the facebook.com server. If you click here on the padlock, it shows that we are securely connected to this site and that the authenticity of the server has been verified by the CA DigiCert. So the question is, what does the browser verify before the connection is considered secure? The first requirement is that the server certificate is signed by a trusted CA, a CA that is trusted by the browser. But this is not enough. We want to make sure that this certificate has been issued to the entity with which we want to establish a secure connection. In the web context, the host name is used to identify the entity. So it is verified whether the host name in the address bar matches the common name field specified in the certificate. If we are connecting to the facebook.com domain, the certificate has to be issued for the facebook.com domain. If it is issued for some other entity, then it will raise an error. I hope it makes sense. Then some other validity checks are performed. Check whether the certificate is valid, whether the extensions in the certificate are consistent, and so on. Now, if we click here on more information, there will be a View Certificate button. If we click on it, we will be able to inspect the certificate chain in Firefox Certificate Viewer. And this is how it looks. We see subject name, issuer name, validity period, subject alternative names for which the certificate is valid. So this certificate is valid not only for facebook.com and all subdomains, but also for facebook.net and others. Here is the intermediate CA that issued the certificate and the root CA. Down there is a download link where we can download the certificate in PEM format. If we download it and parse it using the OpenSSL tool, here is what we will see. Here we see all the fields. Serial number, issuer's distinguished name, validity period, subject name, here is the domain name in the common name field, server's public key, and certificate extensions. CA false, key usage digital signature, extended key usage TLS server and client authentication, and the subject alternative name extension, we can see that this certificate is valid for these websites. And here comes the signature made by the CA that issued the certificate. Now, before issuing a certificate, the CA has to verify the identity of the subject to ensure that the certificate is issued to the legitimate website owner and not some attacker. There are web PKI standards that set the minimal requirements for a subject's identity verification, and there are mainly 3 levels of or types of identity verification. The most basic is the domain validation. It used to cost around $20 a year, but now there is the CA Let's Encrypt and 2 others that provide these domain validated certificates free of charge. Here it is checked whether the party applying for the certificate has control over the domain. The party has to prove that they can receive an email sent to the domain's admin email address, or that they can put some data on the web server where the domain points to. For example, Stack Overflow has a certificate which has been issued based on this domain validation procedure. Then there is organization validation, which costs around $100 a year. Here it is checked whether the party applying for the certificate operates the organization on whose name the domain has been registered. So usually it requires submitting to the CA a certificate from the business registry and a domain registrant. In practice, this data is sent over email and is not digitally signed, so fraud is possible there. Facebook is using a certificate that has been issued based on this organization validation procedure. The third type of validation is the so-called extended validation, which costs around $200 a year. Here it is checked twice whether the person applying for the certificate operates the organization. A bit of irony here, because this extended validation method was introduced after everyone recognized that these organization validated certificates do not add any value, because for the end users there is no visible difference whether they have connected to a website whose certificate has been domain validated or organization validated. As we see here, the user interface is the same in both cases. As a response, the browser vendors, together with the CA community, introduced the extended validation method to solve this problem. Compared to organization validation, in the extended validation process, there should be some CA agent who independently verifies whether the entity operates the organization. The benefit of extended validation is that for extended validated certificates, the browser shows here in the address bar the business name of the company and the country code where the company has been registered. Here you see the example for python.org. However, in practice, the extended validated certificates provide little security benefit, if any, because an attacker who has obtained a domain validated certificate can perform a successful man-in-the-middle attack, and the user will not notice that for a second this company name here in the address bar disappears. Because of this and due to other issues, recently browser vendors have changed the user interface, and today there is no longer a queue in the address bar, which would indicate that this website is using an extended validated certificate. So as you see, there is really no benefit in paying for organization or extended validated certificates, because for the end user, the user experience will be the same as when the user connects to a website that uses a domain validated certificate. For example, here you can see the domain validated versus the organization validated certificate. The only difference between the Stack Overflow and Facebook certificate is this organization field. For Stack Overflow, it is empty, while in Facebook certificate, we can see that this certificate has been issued for Facebook.inc. But that is of little value because most users will not click through the certificate to notice that the certificate has received stronger identity verification. And therefore, unfortunately, the stronger identity verification levels do not increase the security of Web PKI. Here is the list of certificate authorities that are trusted by the Firefox browser. As you see, this list is quite large. There are more than 100 CAs in this list. What is important to note is that any CA in this list can issue a certificate for any website in the world. For example, a CA in China can issue a certificate for a German website and vice versa. A German CA can issue certificates for Chinese websites and so on. What it means is that the whole security of this Web PKI depends on the least secure CA in this list. If any of the CA gets compromised, the attacker can issue a certificate for any server in the world, which is not good. Historically, there have been incidents, but recently the CA and browser community has done a lot of work to detect certificate issuances, and therefore such incidents happen much less than we would expect. One such important security measure is called certificate transparency. The goal of the certificate transparency system is to ensure that all issued certificates are logged into a public database, and therefore, if some certificate is misissued, the legitimate domain owner could detect that and raise the alarm. In a nutshell, it works as follows. All well-behaving certificate authorities are expected to submit all issued certificates to the certificate transparency logs. In practice, there are several log servers operated by different entities. When encountering a certificate, the relying parties, or the browser in this case, will verify whether the certificate is registered in the log. If it is not registered, the browser may reject the certificate and raise an alarm that there is some issue with the CA that needs to be investigated. As a result, we have a public database of all issued certificates, which should be constantly monitored by the domain owners to detect unauthorized certificates that have been issued for the domain. The side effect of certificate transparency is that all TLS server certificates are public, which means that anyone can analyze the certificate dataset and also get the list of all domains and subdomains for which a certificate has been issued. Here is a nice website that provides a powerful tool for searching certificates in this database. Let's look at the certificate signing request, or CSR. So there is a standard data structure which we can use to send our public key and the claimed identity to a CA when applying for a certificate. Here is how we can generate one. First, we have to generate an RSA key pair. Then we run OpenSSL rec to generate a CSR specifying our private key file and the file where the CSR should be written. It will ask several questions to construct the distinguished name. Country code, state or province, locality name, organization unit name, and common name. Now, this common name is important because here we have to specify the domain name for which we want the certificate. As an example, let's write example.com here. Then email address and extra attributes. For the challenge password, we entered something here, the optional company name will be blank, and that's it. Our CSR has been generated. We can look inside it and we see that it is some PEM encoded data structure. We can use OpenSSL to parse it and look at what is inside. So here is our subject name and the public key. All this data is signed using our private key. So by signing this data, we prove to the CA that we have access to the corresponding private key. Alternatively, we can convert CSR to dir and dump ISN on it. We will see this structure. This structure is defined by PKCS10 standard available in this RFC. Now, to not leave it as an abstract concept, let me show you quickly how one could apply for a domain-validated certificate. In this particular example, we are using the web environment of the certificate authority 0SSL. 0SSL offers free domain-validated certificates valid for 90 days. In this process, we have to submit our certificate signing request. We paste our CSR here, and then we click Next Step. Our CSR has been parsed, and now we have to verify that we have control over the domain example.com. We can select one of the three verification methods. Email verification, where we have to prove that we can read emails sent to admin at email account. DNS verification, where we have to create a specific DNS record for our domain, and the HTTP file upload method, where we have to place a file with specific content on a specific location on our example.com website. This is the step where our process ends because we cannot complete any of these verification methods. Now, if we could read emails sent to admin email address, we could obtain a certificate for example.com, and this would allow us to perform successful man-in-the-middle attacks against the users visiting the website, right? Actually, there are a few more email addresses that can be used for proving that we control the domain. A few years ago, there was a case where a random guy was able to obtain a certificate for the Microsoft Windows Live domain because the address hostmaster@ was not reserved and he was able to register it. So if you're an email provider, make sure that these addresses are reserved to prevent unprivileged users registering them. In early days, this list was longer, as some CAs were offering very exotic email addresses, for example, SSL admin for ownership verification. In recent years, the verification procedures have been standardized and CAs are forbidden from inventing their own verification methods. Anyhow, by now you should see how fragile this process actually is. And here is the paradox. Web server certificates are meant to ensure communication confidentiality and prevent man-in-the-middle attacks. However, an attacker who can man-in-the-middle connection between the CA server and the victim's mail server or domain name servers will be able to obtain a valid certificate for the domain. We know that email and DNS infrastructure is vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks. So I would say that WebPKI in practice can provide security only against passive adversaries. But that's of course still much better than not using any encryption at all, right? All right, the homework task here is to implement a utility that issues a TLS server certificate based on a certificate signing request. So here we will play a CA. We have received a certificate signing request from a subject. We extract from the CSR the domain name and public key and issue a certificate that can be used for the TLS server. Issue cert.py, which takes as arguments a CA certificate, a CA private key, a certificate signing request, and writes the issued certificate to a file. When we run it, specifying the required input files, it will output a single line showing the domain name for which the certificate is issued. Of course, in practice, we would verify that the domain belongs to the entity which sent us this certificate signing request, but we assume that this has already been done. Now, these files, the CA certificate and private key, are available in the course repository. You just have to generate a CSR for testing using the OpenSSL tool. Then, when we run OpenSSL verify and the issued certificate specifying the CA certificate and the purpose SSL server, each to return OK. So it will verify whether this issued certificate has been signed by this CA and whether the key usage corresponds to server authentication. For example, if we will specify the purpose SMIME sign, it should return an error unsupported certificate purpose. The tool must support PEM and their inputs, but write the output certificate in PEM format. The tool has to sign the issued certificate using the CA's private key specified in this file. For signing, use the SHA-256 with RSA encryption algorithm. Use the RSA implementation from your fifth homework solution, sign digest info containing a SHA-256 hash, and in the certificate signature algorithm field specify this object identifier. Let's go through the fields that have to be set in the certificate. Specify any certificate serial number you want, it does not matter here. The validity dates of the certificate have to be at least 3 months apart from today. You may hardcode the validity dates, no need to generate them dynamically. Fetch the issuer's distinguished name from the CA certificate and put it into the certificate's issuer field. For the certificate subject name, copy only the common name field from the subject certificate signing request's distinguished name. Other fields must be ignored. Here we are playing a CA that issues domain validated certificates. If we, as a CA, have validated only the domain name, we must not put any other non-validated information from the subject CSR into the certificate. Because we, as a CA, can certify only the information that we have validated. Do not make the mistake of copying the entire distinguished name from the certificate signing request. Okay? Fetch the subject's public key from the CSR and put it into the certificate subject public key info field. The following certificate extensions marked critical have to be set in the certificate. Basic constraints CA false to prevent it from being recognized as a CA certificate. Key usage extension set to digital signature, and extended key usage extension set to server authentication. Your tool does not need to verify the CSR signature. Use your own encoder for encoding and PI-ISN1 for decoding. So this is how the issued certificate should look when parsed by OpenSSL. Issuer name from the CA certificate, subject name from the CSR but only the common name field set, validity dates at least 3 months apart from today, subject public key info from the CSR, extensions CA false, key usage digital signatures, and extended key usage TLS server authentication. Some hints. PI-ISN1 will fail to decode CSR if it contains no attributes, challenge password, since it expects implicit tagging. The workaround is to make sure that your CSR contains a challenge password. This will make the implicitly tagged set to be decoded as a sequence field. PI-ISN1 can easily encode decoded substructures. For example, you can decode the dir structure, take out some substructure specified by these positions here, and re-encode the substructure to dir. This re-encoding is more simple than extracting all the fields from this substructure and using your dir encoder to recreate the structure. This will be useful when extracting the subject public info from the CSR and the subject name from the CA certificate. Also, you may want to implement an ASN1 bitstring dir function, which takes a dir encoded byte string as an input and encapsulates it into an ASN1 bitstring field. The function should take the content passed to it, prepend a 0 byte, prepend length bytes, and type byte, and return the result. This will be useful when encoding a signature value, because a signature value is encoded as a bit string. Alternatively, you can convert the signature to list of bits and pass it to the ASN1 bitstring function, which you have already implemented. But adding this extra function consisting of 2 lines may be simpler. To create the required certificate structure, either read the ASN1 definitions or simply dump ASN1 example certificates to find out the encoding of the certificate and its extensions. You can use this command to convert a PEM encoded certificate to dir and then dump ASN1 it. Don't be surprised that at the beginning you'll probably get ugly errors when OpenSSL tries to decode your incorrect certificate structure. For debugging, use two windows or tabs to compare the dump ASN1 output of your issued certificate with the dump ASN1 output of some known good reference certificate. You should be able to visually spot the difference in the structures. So that is it for the homework, but before we finish this lecture, let's look at two alternative trust models that can be used to authenticate public keys. The first one, Trust on First Use, or TOFU, is used by SSH, Secure Shell Protocol Implementation. SSH is a protocol that is used to securely connect to a remote server, authenticate to it, and execute commands on the server. It is basically an encrypted telnet, if you're old enough to know what telnet is. So here is how this TOFU model is implemented in SSH. This is how we connect to a server, specifying here the username and hostname. If we connect to the server for the first time, we will see this prompt. The authenticity of host cannot be established. This is the hash of the server's public key. Do you want to continue connecting? So we got a public key from the server, and now we have to decide whether we want to trust this public key. We are supposed to check whether this is really the public key of the server and not the public key of an attacker who has intercepted our connection to the server and is performing a man-in-the-middle attack. The correct action now would be to contact the administrator of the server and ask whether this is the authentic public key of the server. The administrator would provide us fingerprint of the authentic public key, and we would compare it with the one shown here. And it is important to compare the entire fingerprint. It is not enough to check just the beginning or the end, because an attacker, by brute forcing, can generate a key pair that will have a similar fingerprint, and this way he may successfully trick us accepting a forged public key. Okay? Now, of course, we can just ignore all the hassle and simply enter yes here. The SSH client will display permanently added the key and host to the list of known hosts, and we can proceed by sending our password to the server. Now, if this was the attacker's public key, then here we will effectively give our password to the attacker, right? The SSH client maintains a small file named known hosts where it maps hosts to the public keys. So this here is a base64 encoded public key of the server. When we connect to the same host in the future, the SSH client verifies the public key received from the server to the public key stored in this file, and if they match, the connection is assumed secure, and we can proceed with authentication by sending our password. Now, if the public key suddenly changes, we will get this ugly error when connecting. Warning, remote host identification has changed. It is possible that someone is doing something nasty. So there are two possibilities. Either some attacker is performing a man-in-the-middle attack trying to impersonate the server, or maybe the key changed simply because the server was reinstalled and hence a new, different SSH key was generated. Who knows? To get around this error, we would have to remove the old public key from the SSH known hosts file and start from the beginning where SSH asks to accept the key. So the assumption in this trust model is that when we connect for the first time, there is no network attacker that can perform active attacks. The attacker may appear later, but we will detect the attack because the public key will change. And perhaps this is a quite reasonable assumption, because most likely the first time when we will connect to the server, we will be in the same trusted network as the server. Later, when we use some insecure public Wi-Fi and someone performs a man-in-the-middle attack, we will be able to detect this, right? Now, could we make this process more secure? From the security perspective, this is a bad example because here a critical security check is passed to the user and the user can easily bypass it by entering yes here. A more secure design would be not to show this fingerprint here, but ask it from the user. refusing to continue until the user has found and entered the hash of the expected public key. Now, since most users would be too frustrated by such a security check, in practice, the SSH client uses this trust on first use concept, which is less secure. At least here, the SSH client does a good job by not letting the user easily skip this warning. Some other SSH clients, for example, SSH client PuTTY used in Windows, will allow the user to easily click through the warning. As you see, it has the accept button here, which means that PuTTY users are more likely to ignore this warning and therefore are more susceptible to successful man-in-the-middle attacks. Now, this trust on first use trust model is used also by browsers as a fallback mechanism. For example, when a browser encounters a server certificate that cannot be verified, it will show this warning message. If we click here on Advanced, and then here on Accept the risk and continue, the browser will pin this certificate to this hostname and will perform no checks on this certificate in the future. As a result, we will be able to get to the website. And if you want to remove this binding, we have to click here on the Remove Exception button. So this is how the trust on first use trust model works in SSH and browsers. Another somewhat exotic trust model is the Web of Trust. The Web of Trust is a decentralized trust model used by PGP, and it works as follows. Let's say we have met some persons and we have authenticated or verified their public keys in a face-to-face interaction, and therefore we trust the public keys of these persons. So these would be these public keys here. What we can do now is that we can extend our trust circle by defining that we trust also the keys that these persons have verified. This way, we can extend our trust to public keys that we have not verified ourselves. In other cases, we may trust the person's public key, but we will not rely on the keys that the person has marked trusted. And this is basically the idea of the Web of Trust trust model. Now, as you see, this trust model may work in small communities, but it does not scale well on the internet when we have to engage in secure transactions with many parties with whom we don't have any previous contact. So, in practice, this trust model is pretty much dead, as well as the encryption software PGP itself. All right, that is it for this lecture. Good luck with the homework.